Welcome back to Tabletop Titans and another Titan Tactics. When deciding which army you want to play in Warhammer 40k, it's essential that it matches the style that you want to play. Today we're going to be discussing everything about control style armies and what that means. Of course, if you do find this video to be useful, please hit that like and subscribe button down below. It really does help us grow the channel. With that, let's dive on in and take a look. So before we continue to the specifics of control armies, let's talk about what we mean by control in the first place. Control armies exhibit a few different characteristics. First of all, and the most important one, is your decisions are the decisions that are going to dictate the pace of the game. This is not an army that wants to react to the opponent. It is the one that is going to make the first move and decide what the opponent has to do in return. So that's an important attribute of a control style army. Secondly, it's all about objectives first and killing second. You might have to kill something, but it's always going to be in service of scoring your primary, your secondary, or gaining some other advantage over your opponent. It really does not focus on running on headlong into the enemy. So if that's your style, control might not be it. And of course, finally, it's about controlling the board state through positioning and moving. It's all about the minutia of where do you place your models when and how do they move. So these are the three defining attributes we're thinking about when we look at control style armies. Let's take a look at the first one. Probably the quintessential control style army is the Genestealer cults, or the GSC as we'll largely refer to them as. And they have a number of strengths and weaknesses, which we're going to look into first to kind of give you a sense of how this army plays specifically within the context of control. First of all, this is very much an MSU horde style army. What does this mean? It means multiple small units. These are very cheap, very efficient units that you can run many of. While the army does have several large units, by and large, it is defined by all these little toolkit kind of units running around and scoring. So that's an important attribute that gives you lots of strength and flexibility. Speaking of flexibility, their second main attribute and strength is toolkit. There are many stratagems, many units that fulfill different types of roles. And so this means that this is really going to be a toolkit style army that allows you to adapt to different situations, different opponents, and different problems. And finally, it's about providing dynamic threats. Through a number of different ways, you can deliver nasty, hard-hitting units in melee, in shooting, and really keep your opponent unsure of where that hammer is going to come down until it's too late. So really, these are the three big strengths of the army. Let's talk about the weaknesses, however. First of all, this army is very fragile. It's going to be performing on a knife's edge, where if you mess up, you're going to lose a ton of your units. Ultimately, they don't have amazing saves. They don't generally have a lot of toughness, so it's going to be very fragile, and if someone is able to get into your back lines early, then that could be a big problem for your game plan. Secondly, this army is very much optimized towards single targets. The way that the crossfire markers work is you effectively want to pick one target, double down on them, get around them, expose them, and kind of stack a number of buffs and debuffs going into a single target. So if you're playing against someone else who also has MSU, it's going to give you a much tougher time as you have to spread out your different targets in a way that doesn't really synergize with what you want. The third and final weakness for this army is one that is pretty common amongst the control style armies. It is complicated. Control is all about managing all your different buffs and debuffs and putting them in the right place at the right time. And so, as such, it can be very easy to mess up and crash and burn. So if you're not looking for a complicated army, once again, control might not be your style, but if you love getting into the minutia of all those details, this is exactly the place to be. So now we've gone over the strengths and weaknesses of the GSC, let's talk about their goals and the tools they have to achieve them. So first of all, one of the major goals of the GSC is to accomplish their secondaries. When you're designing a Genestealer cult list, you often have these secondaries in mind, and you're going to show up to the table expecting to take certain ones each and every match. Again, you are controlling the situation from the beginning. They have amazing secondaries such as Brood, Swarm, and Ambush, and these are things you can design around almost regardless of who you're playing against. So they're focusing on that and trying to achieve those, and everything else is secondary. Speaking of secondary things they want to do, they want to hem their opponent in. They want to use early game movement to get up there and block them in. And finally, they want to optimize the attrition. As we mentioned, this is a very fragile army, and it's important to stretch the value of all your units to make sure you reach the fifth and final turn of the game while still being able to score. So how do they accomplish all these things? Well, first of all, this army has a lot of movement shenanigans. First of all, we have the blips, which allow you to deploy your entire army without your opponent knowing which blips are which units. Gives you strength, gives you flexibility, gives you decision making. You also have a ways of bringing in units from deep strike very close, sometimes up to just beyond 3 inches. And this, once again, is going to force your opponent to make decisions, to react to your decisions, and it's going to let you be positioned where you want to be when you want to be. Of course, this army right now in particular has a number of amazing shooting profiles, particularly things like the industrial weapons that you can just have in absolute massive quantity, and it by and large is a shooting army and a movement army right now. Finally, of course, there's many flexible buffs. We mentioned how one of the weaknesses, of course, is how complicated this army is, how easy it is to mess up, but the flexible buffs here are essential. You can have a way to cast powers across the whole board, you can pass buffs across the entire board, and things like the industrial weapons have extremely flexible stratagems that adjust based off of the profile and the situation that you're in. So ultimately, this army is very well positioned to win as a control army, to accomplish its goals via movement, via flexibility, via scoring power, and all these things come together to make the perfect control army. Well, how do you follow that one up? It's tough, but the Drukhari do a great job because they are also, and almost always have been, an army about control. Let's talk about their strengths and weaknesses. First of all, they are once again an MSU style build with lots of smaller units. They're very, very fast via a number of different fast movement speeds and transports. And of course, they have some powerhouse characters, something we did not see in the GSC, but the Drukhari have in spades. They have absolutely hard-hitting characters that don't really hurt the army too much if you lose them, which means that you can keep on going and get that value. Of course, like the GSC, they have some similar weaknesses. They are very, very fragile. They do get tougher as the game goes on, getting access to better invulnerable saves and other abilities, but ultimately these are pretty low saves and, again, low toughness. Their victory conditions are honestly one of their weaknesses, which sounds like a major flaw, but what this means is they're not going into the game with such a defined plan as the GSC are. For example, you often are having to adapt to the board or the player that you have in front of you, but they have lots of options that will help kind of make up for this weakness. Another weakness is certain types of damage output they will struggle into. Because they want to play this trading game, you have small units that have good output for what they are, but if you have a singular big target that you need to go into, you're going to be paying the price by putting in many smaller units just to get rid of one. So that ultimately is one of their biggest weaknesses. And now for the goals and the tools that they have to accomplish them. First of all, Drukhari are very primary focused, whereas secondaries can kind of fluctuate from game to game. They are great at playing primary in the sense that they have amazing transports, they have lots of objectives secured, and very efficient priced units. They are also trying to optimize that attrition. As we mentioned, they get stronger as the game progresses, and so it's important that they are able to kind of stretch along that whole path and keep an eye out for people putting pressure early on and kind of keeping them in their base, losing units before they're at their full power. Last of all, they also want to control the board state, using all these MSU to move block your opponent, get in position, and really decide where you need to be the next turn and be their turn in advance. As we've alluded to here, they have a few tools to help with these goals. Of course, they have access to a number of fight last abilities between the Incubi, Drazar Master Blades, who is an Incubi, as well as the Archon. These fight last abilities help you hit along multiple fronts and force your opponent to not be able to react. Of course, they have lots of throwaway units, amazing things like Reavers for behind enemy lines, which got even stronger. You have troops everywhere. You can focus on troops in this army, and it's going to be quite strong. And as we mentioned, these small units that hit decently hard are going to trade really well. You throw a cheaper unit into a more expensive unit, and you can often come out on top staying alive with perhaps one of your troops to hold the objective. Last of all, the transports cannot be understated. Their ability to keep your fragile troops safe early game and deliver into the late game is also going to be essential to mastering the Drukhari. So overall, you can see lots of similarities to the Genestealer cults with a bit more of an emphasis on speed, on powerful characters, and punching at the right moment in the right time. While we're talking about elves, let's talk about the Harlequins. Today, one of my favorite factions, we're going to be looking at the strengths and the weaknesses first, of course. Strengths. They're very fast. They actually put the Drukhari to shame in how quick they are. They have access to lots of transports. They automatically advance and charge, and they have a base movement of 8 even on their infantry, so very fast. They also have some powerhouse units where you can really amp up their killing ability with stratagems, with special war gear and things, and so they can really hit quite hard. Kind of on the level of powerhouse characters of Drukhari, but they have less of them in a given list. Last of all, they are a very compact army. The profile, the silhouette of your army is important when you're fragile. You need to be able to hide, you need to get into the right position at the right time, and particularly when it comes to some secondaries, you need to be able to fit where you can fit. So being compact is a huge advantage. However, of course, some of these strengths become weaknesses. We're talking about the fact that these units are so fast, flexible, and hit hard. Well, they're quite pricey actually, and it adds up as you start adding special weapons to each of these troops. They can get very expensive, and the army can be a bit small for how fragile it is. Speaking of which, it is a very fragile army. Having a 5+ invulnerable save across the board is quite scary, and ultimately they are only toughness 3 bodies. They can gain buffs to make them tougher, but at the end of the day, some armies are going to really give them a run for their money if they get direct line of sight into the Harlequins. And of course, their damage output, while strong, can be very predictable. The army has a ton of damage 2, AP 2 profiles, and so if you have damage reduction or AP reduction, it's going to severely hurt the Harlequins, and honestly, they have a tough time adjusting to these different tools and different profiles when they come up. So with that having been said, what are the goals and what are the tools that the Harlequins have available to them to win the game? Well, first of all, they have amazing secondaries, and this continues to remain a fact. And these secondaries, they can score largely regardless of their opponents. They are often doing things like behind enemy lines, they're doing take your places, they are doing a deadly performance, and they have access to amazing psychic secondaries. And by and large, you can count on taking these into most games, allowing you to control the situation no matter who you're going into. As far as primary goes, because of things like the transports and multiple layers they have, they're also quite good at scoring primary, where you can be on an objective, accomplish a goal, and even if your opponent shoots you out of your transport, you can pop out of line of sight, staying on the objective. So strong secondary game, strong primary game, and finally, trading. This is an attribute common to virtually all of the control style armies. Harlequins excel at sending in a single unit to deal with a single problem, and again, trading up in a way similar to the Drukhari we just mentioned. So let's talk more specifically about some of the overarching tools that Harlequins have to achieve these goals. First of all, a big attribute about them is rules denial. This again helps in your control game. They have ways of negating different enemy profiles, reducing them, deciding where they can go in. There's a plethora of different ways you can control the game by adjusting what your opponent is actually able to do to otherwise standard style units. The transports, as we mentioned, are very strong. They're cheap, they're shooty, they're relatively tough, and they're open-topped, which means you can gain access to the amazing shooting profiles on these units, such as Death Jesters and Fusion Pistols, despite being in a tougher shell of the vehicle. And last of all, their psychic game is quite powerful. Often running 2 Psychers, this is going to let them score their secondaries, give them extra movement, and give them access to targeted mortal wounds. So these are the things that they can use to accomplish their goals of controlling the state of the game and being where they need to be when they need to be. Finishing up the trio of the Elf factions, let's talk about the Eldari. They have a number of strengths and weaknesses, and let's go through them. Strengths, well, they're very fast, just like both of their Eldar cousins, and they have strong synergies, being able to stack various different buffs and debuffs to focus down single targets. They also have a number of risk mitigation in the form of their fate dice, their psychic powers, and some pretty reliable buffs that you can get. So it's all about controlling the game and knowing that you're going to reduce the chances of randomness happen to as small as you possibly can. They do, however, have some weaknesses like the other Eldar and like the GSC. They're quite fragile, so if you can get shot at, if you can get charged, you might be in trouble. They are also very expensive, which means the armor is going to be pretty small, and it's going to be very susceptible to mistakes as everything comes crashing down if someone makes it in. And in a similar vein, they are also very character-centric. As we mentioned, these buffs and debuffs are essential, and by and large, they do come from characters, things like Farseers that are going to be giving them extra powers, and the moment that these characters get knocked out of the game, you're going to start to really struggle. So now, what are the goals and the tools of the Eldari faction? Well, first of all, they're great at trading up. While the units are expensive, you can decide where you want to be when you want to be, and can have a very strong alpha strike in the sense that they can redeploy, they can get up in their opponent's face and really force them to make a move and make a decision early on. They, of course, are trying to kill and score while still remaining hidden. This means things like popping out, performing psychic ritual, and then battle focusing back out of line of sight, and similar things where you strike where you can and make sure that your opponent cannot hit you back. This is essential to playing such a fragile army. Finally, of course, optimizing attrition is another important one, as we see their ability to balance the way that they score across the game, keep your assets alive, and not expend them as fast as some other aggressive armies might. So this is also important. How do they achieve these things? Well, pretty simple. First of all, Psychic is going to give them a number of different backups and control and debuffs that is necessary. This is an army that does Psychic almost better than anybody. We also have the Strains of Fate, which allow you to replace dices with 6s before you roll them, ensuring that you have these key rolls where and when you need them. And finally, of course, the things like the Incarn and the Inari are going to throw the entire game out of whack in the sense that they are able to really capitalize on your opponent making moves and position when and where they need to be. So honestly, this almost fits in a category of its own in its ability to solve problems that your opponent didn't even know you could. We are now in Imperial land as we talk about the Adeptus Mechanicus. We have the strengths and the weaknesses. It might be surprising to some that we have the Adeptus Mechanicus in this category, but by and large and throughout their history, Adeptus Mechanicus has always been about control. Let's talk about it. So first of all, their strengths, they have amazing synergies. It's all about stacking a million buffs on a single unit or a couple units and doing exactly what you need when you need. Sensing a theme here? It's also about positioning. They do have access to some redeploys, they can get access to deep strike, and they have lots of ways of gaining extra movement through things like their doctrine imperatives. And finally, of course, it wouldn't be AdMech if we didn't talk about the firepower, which might feel like more of an aggressive army, but it's important to use this firepower in directed ways and ensure that there isn't someone coming right back into you and tagging you up in melee. There are, of course, a number of weaknesses, kind of like the Eldari. These are very character-centric. They need lots of characters to be throwing at their buffs. So this means that you're paying for all those characters, and more importantly, if those characters die, you might be out high and dry without the firepower and the support that you actually need. Second of all, their data sheets have kind of fallen by the wayside over the number of years that they've been out, and the data sheets without the buffs are kind of mediocre. They're okay, they're not too expensive, but they don't really shine without their buffs. So the moment you mess up on that, or the moment your opponent turns them off, they actually drop very steeply. And of course, this kind of relates to the third and final weakness for them, which is their reliance on these buffs. And this is probably made most apparent in the current CP state of the game. We don't have many command points. In AdMech, we're absolutely a book designed for when we had many command points. You would spend many of them before game to buy different upgrades and relics and warlord traits. And now you don't have enough to actually play the rest of the game, which they really rely on. They have amazing strats, but if you don't have CP to play them, it's really going to hurt them. So this is probably their single greatest weakness right now in the game. So what does the Adeptus Mechanicus want to do, and what are the tools they have to actually achieve it? Well, first of all, it's all about keeping vehicles alive. They have an amazing secondary where they need to keep their vehicles alive and have them perform kills while not having them get killed in return. And so it's about keeping these key units alive at the right time while also killing things. Secondly, of course, you want to keep your synergies intact. You need to plan multiple turns ahead. How do you get to be where you need to be while also preserving these buffs? And it can be very easy to trail out or lose range on a buff from a character, and they might have to switch from one flank to another. So it's important that you're able to control where you are, and in some cases play relatively centrally with the character so you can kind of lean to one side or the other. And finally, of course, they want to screen. This is an army that by and large is going to want to shoot. They can fight, they're great in melee, but they want to have these big shooting blocks, and it's important that you not let your opponent get in and also do a lot of damage through things like mortal wounds. So screening with smaller MSU style units is essential. So how do they achieve these? Well, they have a number of different flexible ways of responding to your opponents. They have access to fight last on all of their Cult Mechanicus characters and units, and also they have access to fall back and shoot and a number of different things that will help mitigate these moments where the plane will go wrong, because it will. If this army did not have fall back and shoot, it would be even worse than it is today. And look at previous editions, this was one of the #1 ways to beat them. They also have, of course, many offensive strats that are flexible and able to adapt to whatever your opponent is doing. Do you need to be able to move quite fast and shoot without penalties? Do you need to auto wound things? Do you need extra AP or more shots? If you name it, you probably have a strat for it for your weapons. So those are essential to accomplishing their goals. And finally, this army can be very tough, very defensive due to the mechanicals, their imperatives, stacking different traits, and of course, stratagems. Last but certainly not least, we have the Astra Militarum, or as we call them, the Imperial Guard. These are absolutely a hard-hitting army, but they really need to control the state of the game to be able to score highly. So let's talk about it. First of all, their strengths and their weaknesses. Obvious strength, firepower. They hit like an absolute truck. They have lots of amazing shooting between big tanks. They have mortars shooting on line of sight, even without penalty sometimes, and they have amazing units like the Kazarkin. So firepower, absolutely a tool. Second of all, durability. They are humble troops. Even the Acadians can be quite tough, and this is important to be able to control the board, step out, and be able to accomplish your goals without, one, losing too much because they are cheap, and two, being surprisingly tough due to a number of stratagems and traits. And third, they have strong secondaries. This is what makes or breaks different armies, and they have secondaries that reward them for pushing out into the board, controlling the board state. This, in an interesting way, runs counter to the traditional weakness of the Guard, where they've wanted to castle off. Now, Guard players are rewarded for getting their boots on the ground, moving up into the mid-board, controlling it, and really playing the whole game. So it not only helps with their core stratagem, but also helps with their secondaries that really encourage them to do so. What are their weaknesses? Well, this is another army that has lots of character-centric buffs. So if you take out their characters early, they're going to really struggle. If you're playing Guard, you need to keep them alive. They also really struggle into mortal wounds. They have virtually no defense against this, and I guess the one saving grace is, of course, that you can have lots and lots of infantry to protect against mortals coming in, and you're not losing too much in return. And the third and final weakness is, again, they're complicated. Many buffs need to pass along different lines and exploding from different sources, and so it can be easy to mess up. It's going to take lots and lots of practice to really excel at them, but if you can, amazing army. So what does the Astra Militarum want, and what are the tools that they have to do so? Well, first of all, it's really about controlling the state of the game and controlling the board more than anything. They really want to, again, push out to the mid-board, position so they can shoot any counter responses and not get caught off guard. They want to have, to support that, waves of infantry and not have to really stretch them too thin. They can take enough that if they parcel them out each turn, it will actually work out. But they're going to be afraid of people knocking out those infantry early and kind of losing their ability to move up the mid-board as it continues. This ties to their third goal, which is really guardsman attrition. These are one of the primary ways that they score some of their secondaries, and they need to parcel them out carefully throughout the game, supporting things like the tanks and the mortars in the back. So the tools, of course, they have amazing ways to really negate an opponent's ability to respond. Things like allowing mortars to shoot out of line of sight with bonuses. It's going to help other players that are trying to play control. They have ways to ignore wound caps, which is amazing against armies that would have traditionally been a huge problem for Guard because they rely largely on shooting. Their battle tanks, more flexible than ever. Having their turrets be able to shoot out of combat while they're tagged in gives you that flexibility that you need to not have your plan just crumble because a single Stormboy tagged into one of your tanks. And finally, of course, orders give you the flexibility that you need in the place that you need it, which again, a theme that we're seeing throughout all of these different armies. Do you need to move faster here? Do you need to have objectives secured here? Do you need to fall back and shoot? Very flexible. It's going to let you adapt to the scenario at hand. Of course, we have lots of other content coming out virtually every day, so check that out. And thank you everyone so much. That's going to be it for me. I'll catch you next time on the tabletop. Bye!